Hi, I'm Naima Claiborne, and I'm going to be talking about the school to prison pipeline for my social issues presentation. And I'm going to be analyzing this and looking at it through the lens of conflict theory. So, first, I wanted to talk about just what the pipeline is, and I think that this quote from the ACLU really describes it very well. And they say that the pipeline is referring to the policies and practices that push our nation's school children, especially our most at-risk children, out of classrooms and into the juvenile and criminal justice systems. This pipeline reflects the prioritization of incarceration over education. So, first, I wanted to talk about just how this social issue manifests within schools. So it obviously, I feel like in order to understand this, you have to understand where it comes from. And I think that obviously it begins with the racism that is institutionalized within all of our social systems, um, which contributes to inadequate funding in public schools, which is kind of also manifests in ways like overcrowded classrooms, lack of qualified faculty, no funding for counselors, no funding for mental health, and things like that, and also no funding for textbooks. And then it also manifests sort of in this interesting way of like incentives to push out lower performing students. So I read a lot about how schools will push out students to improve their test scores. So if students aren't performing up to a certain standard, they will push them out in order to improve like how the school will look, which pushes out the obviously like the lower income students because they might be the people who have less access to, tutors and things like that, and also obviously students of color who have less access to that. So that is another way that students of color are pushed out of schools. And then also the zero tolerance policy directly impacts students of color because it imposes very severe punishments regardless of circumstances. So it might be like a student of color and a white student might engage in similar acts within a school, but the one who gets the more severe punishment will be the student of color because of that, obviously that institutionalized racism and the racial stigma and biases that a lot of teachers will possess within these schools. And yeah, students of color are just much more impacted by the zero tolerance policies. And then also there's a heavy reliance on police to like monitor students. And obviously with over policing comes with students being pushed into the incarceration system even more. And then overall, this obviously increases suspension of all students, but specifically Black and Brown students are the ones that are targeted by a lot of these policies. Um, and this suspension is linked to an increased chance of dropping out of school. And also, this just like locks students in an extremely stressful and harmful environment, honestly, perpetuating a lot of disengagement and mental health issues because you're trapped in this environment with physical, real police officers. It's almost like this behaves as a sort of prison in a way, and it's very like isolating. Um, and then lastly, once students are pushed out, there's a lot of barriers to reentry into traditional schools because once you're pushed into the incarceration system, it becomes very difficult to become like reintegrated into a regular educational environment. And then also students who are pushed out have increased chances of court involvement. And then once they are pushed out, like the court involvement sort of comes from like not having support and not having access to resources. You have a higher likelihood of being unemployed when you drop out or you're pushed out. You have a higher likelihood to engage in criminal acts, and then also the police within schools are just like like direct arrests are happening. And in general, this just definitely acts as a way to criminalize students of color. Um, yeah, all of these kind of um just increased chances of being pushed into the incarceration system. And then I have a graph here that shows students who are assigned to a school that makes heavy use of suspension. And it shows how suspension increases likelihood of incarceration, especially for Black and Brown students. So you can obviously see how Black and Brown students are more impacted by suspension and obviously have higher impacts and like effects on incarceration as well. And then next, I kind of wanted to just talk about some important data that I found when I was researching this topic. So I found that 2.7 million students experienced at least one out of school suspension during the 2015-2016 school year. Black students are 3 times more likely to be suspended than their white peers. And then of Black students who attend urban high schools, 60% of them who drop out will go to prison at some point. Black children account for 15% of the total enrollment of K through 12 public schools. yet make up 38.8% of expulsions with educational services and 33.3% of expulsions without educational services, which is just a very crazy statistic to really understand because if the students of color are not making up that much of the school, yet they are almost 40% of expulsions. Um, and then the graph below shows enrollment by ethnicity versus students getting expelled under the zero tolerance policy by ethnicity in Oklahoma. So I thought this was another interesting graph to look at because it shows how um, it just shows how they're being incarcerated and how Black and brown students are more likely to be incarcerated under the zero tolerance policies and how they are more heavily impacted or disproportionately impacted by those policies. And then next, I wanted to obviously tie in the conflict theory. So first, I wanted to define this theory. I thought about it as how society is shaped over ongoing struggles over power and resources, how dominant groups maintain power and privilege. And for this case, I think it's important to note also the past conflicts that occurred between the white dominant groups and marginalized communities and how that obviously instilled institutionalized racism and how that is the leading factor of why all of this is happening. I think that's important to note that as well. So I wanted to talk about first how a sociologist would understand this issue. So like I mentioned before, a conflict theorist is going to think about conflict over resources, and they would probably view education as a vital tool in our society, but also something that perpetuates inequality and also perpetuates these systems of and these different like power dynamics and also these like stuff like that. Um, and also, I think that they would view the education system as a space where these norms and values from the dominant culture are instilled into people of color to further marginalize them in society, which I'll get into more when I talk about specifically the school to prison pipeline. And then, so yeah, now I'm going to talk about how sociologists understand this pipeline. So I think that it would probably be understood as how it starts with the conflict between the dominant white group and the marginalized communities, obviously beginning with the institutionalized racism, and how racial stratification is what fuels things like the zero tolerance policy, lack of funding, bias from teachers, low performance incentives, and the over-policing or over-policing and also targeting students of color. Those are all a result of institutionalized racism. And like I mentioned before, I think that education systems instill these feelings of inferiority in marginalized groups through limiting their opportunities and preparing them to be either unemployed or working to survive, which are two things that obviously have been linked to leading to incarceration once they're expelled or once they drop out of school. That kind of ties that in. And then lastly, I think the labeling theory is another like important sociological concept to note because being labeled as a troublemaker or deviant for engaging in the same activities as white students is kind of what is causing this like these things like the zero tolerance policy where like it's just like harsh punishments on students of color. They're being labeled as things that they're not and they're being criminalized. And then next, these are like the proposed solutions that I thought about as well as like what I researched that sociologists are thinking about. So I saw a lot of information about how they want to improve school environments to instead of fostering like an environment of obviously kind of prison-like I mentioned before, they want to foster a sense of belonging and equity. They want to replace harsh discipline practices with something more focused on restorative justice. They want to reduce the role of police in schools, remove zero tolerance policies and lower performance incentives, and also advocate for counselors and mental health support. And then as far as limitations, a lot of these limitations I thought about. So I thought about how first of all, a lot of them don't really reach the root of the issue, which is like how I've mentioned over and over again. This all sort of stemmed from this institutionalized racism. So I think it's important that you implement strategies to combat that issue before moving on to the education system because it all kind of trickles down into other um I don't know, like other parts of society. So I think that it's important to combat that issue first. And I think that a lot of these solutions were kind of temporary and could easily be undermined by larger issues that are happening outside of schools, like discriminatory policing, which obviously happens outside of education, but still impacts the students that are going to school. Um, and obviously leads to increased likelihoods of dropping out and being suspended and things like that. So I think you have to kind of target those issues as well. And then again, without funding, it's really not possible and will most likely not change the underlying power dynamics. And I think that it's important that you like kind of deal with the root issue and then go into like how can we fund um, these other incentives into um, how can we fund these other things like the mental health care and counseling care and things like that. And then here are my resources and references. Okay, thank you.